In this video, I'll cover some of the topology editor preferences in VM Maestro, the user interface for VIRL. First, let's look at VM Maestro's default behavior. I select IOSV from the palette, and then click on the canvas to drop an IOSV node. After I drop a node, you'll notice that the cursor still has this plus decorator to indicate that the Add IOSV Node tool is still active. You can add multiple IOSV nodes by simply clicking multiple times on the canvas. To select one of those nodes, you must return to the palette and click the Select tool. Then you can select the nodes to set their properties or adjust their position on the canvas. Alternatively, if you're currently adding nodes to the canvas and you'd like to switch back to the Select tool without returning to the palette, you can simply press the Escape key. VM Maestro will revert to the Select tool, and again you can select the nodes to set their properties or rearrange their position on the canvas. You'll see a similar behavior in VM Maestro when creating connections. Select the Connect tool from the palette, and after you create a connection between two nodes, you'll notice that the connection tool is still active and you can continue creating new connections without returning to the palette. I also want to point out that as you create connections, by default, VM Maestro automatically adds interfaces to the nodes for those connections. So if we connect IOSv4 to IOSv5, VM Maestro automatically added a GIGI02 interface to IOSv4. If we create another connection, VM Maestro adds a third interface, GIGI03, for the new connection to IOSv6. But what if you want a connection between two nodes to use specific interfaces? For example, let's look at the connection between IOSv3 and IOSv4. Notice that it uses the GIGI03 interface on the IOSv3 side. What if we wanted this connection to use the GIGI01 interface on the IOSv3? We could try dragging the connection in the node editor, but VM Maestro is not going to let you attach it to the GIGI01 interface because that interface is already used in IOSv3's connection to IOSv1. You could delete the connections and recreate them and try to get them in the right order, but there's an easier way to do it. I'm going to delete this topology and start over, but first we're going to set a couple of topology editor preferences. So go to File, Preferences, and select Topology Editor. First, let's enable the first setting, revert back to Palette's default tool, and click OK. With this preference set, VM Maestro will revert automatically to the Select tool. So if we drop an IOSV node on the canvas, we can immediately select it, reposition it, or set its properties. To drop another node, we have to go back to the palette and select the node type again. Again, if we select IOSV, we see that the pointer has the plus decorator, but as soon as we drop the node, it reverts to the select pointer, and we can select the node to set its properties. This setting is useful if you prefer to set your properties or position your nodes as you put them on the canvas. You'll see the same behavior with the Connect tool. So as soon as you create a connection, VM Maestro reverts to the standard selection pointer and you can select nodes. To create another connection, you'll have to return to the palette and select the Connect tool before creating a new connection. While some people like this setting because it makes VM Maestro match the behavior of other drawing tools, personally I prefer to use the default behavior. We're going to go back to File, Preferences, Topology Editor, and we're going to disable that setting. We're also going to disable the second setting, Associate New Connections with Interfaces Silently. Click OK and recreate the topology. Now since we just disabled the first setting in the topology editor preferences, we're back to the default behavior there, where we can drop multiple nodes in the topology without returning to the palette. But with the connection tool, we'll see that now when we click on a node, VM Maestro presents the list of interfaces on that node subtype. For IOSv3, remember that we're going to reserve the GIGI01 interface for the connection to IOSv4. So here we skip over GIGI01 and select GIGI02. We can see in the node editor that IOSv3 has a single interface, but it's GIGI02. Again, when I create another connection, I go from IOSv2 to IOSv3, and we are again presented with a list of interfaces. And again, I skip GIGI01 on the IOSv3 node. Now, when I create the connection from IOSv3 to IOSv4, GIGI01 is available, and I can use that interface on both sides of this connection. So when we disable the second setting in the topology editor preferences, VM Maestro no longer automatically creates the interface, and we have to select the interface each time we create a connection. With the default behavior where VM Maestro creates connections automatically, creating topologies is slightly faster and easier, but it's only faster if you don't care which interfaces your connections use. So again, you can find these preferences under File, Preferences, Topology Editor. The first preference controls whether VM Maestro reverts back to the Select tool automatically after you drop a node on the canvas or create a connection. By default, it's disabled. The second preference setting controls whether VM Maestro automatically creates interfaces when you create a connection. By default, it's enabled, but you can disable this preference if you prefer to select the interfaces yourself. You can ignore that third setting about the shortest path algorithm. We didn't cover it today since it generally only applies to topologies with hundreds of connections.